So we're going to pick up with the next presentation on cost effectiveness related to herpes zoster vaccine. Dr. Leidner.
Hi, my name is Andrew Leitner. I'll be presenting an overview of two economic models that assess the cost effectiveness of herpes zoster vaccinations. So just to say thanks to the collaborators, this is a presentation of work that was conducted outside of CDC by two teams, one team at GSK, one team at Merck, and there was a lot of review at CDC and in the ACIP work group, all of whom helped me put these slides together. So I appreciate their help. As the reviewer and presenter, I have no conflicts of interest to declare. So as a roadmap for our discussion today, I'll be presenting a few fundamental aspects of cost effectiveness models, followed by a background of the two models that we're talking about in particular, then followed by some base case results. And I'm going to bring up some base case results fairly early because the two models do have some important differences in their results, and the middle section of this talk will be about where those differences are coming from. And then we'll conclude with a discussion of overall cost effectiveness results from both the models, and then I'll provide a summary and then a discussion of some limitations. My objective in this presentation is to describe two cost effectiveness models which were developed by two different teams, Merck and GSK. There is another cost effectiveness model in the works by a CDC team, and those results will be presented in the next meeting in October. A cost effectiveness ratio can be considered a price paid per health unit gained. And health unit, in some of these models, it will vary. One very common one is a cost per case avoided. In this case, we'll be talking about costs per quality adjusted life year gained. And a QALY, as it's abbreviated, is suitable to herpes zoster because QALY accounts for morbidity loss, and the main disease burden of herpes zoster is in pain, which is a morbidity outcome. Final note on cost effectiveness ratios is that they always compare two potential strategies. So in this little green box, we're comparing a vaccination strategy to a no vaccination strategy. You could also compare vaccination with vaccine A versus vaccination with vaccine B. And throughout the presentation, I'll be using this notation of strategy 1 versus strategy 2 to define our scenarios. The cost effectiveness ratio is a result of calculations based on assumptions, or you could also call these assumptions parameters, or you could call them inputs. The assumptions combined with how they're calculated together is the cost effectiveness model, and the output of that model is the cost effectiveness ratio. Parameters can include many things related to the disease system. Intervention effectiveness, in this presentation we'll be mainly focusing on vaccine effectiveness, but also cost of the intervention, cost of disease outcomes, and others. An important aspect of these two studies is that data varies based on the parameter that you're focusing on, and this will come up later. As one quick concrete example of how cost effectiveness ratios work, you can imagine intervention A has a cost effectiveness ratio of $1 million per quality adjusted life year, and intervention B has a cost effectiveness ratio of $10,000 per quality adjusted life year. If this were the case, you would say intervention A is less cost effective than B because with A, you pay $1 million for one QALY, and with B, you pay $10,000 for one QALY. Moving into background on the model and some base case results. So the current vaccine that's licensed and recommended is zoster live attenuated vaccine. We've been abbreviating it ZVL. I'll be referring to it as the live vaccine. It's a single-dose vaccine. It's been received by 20 to 25 million people. The candidate vaccine is a herpes zoster subunit vaccine. It's a 2-dose vaccine. I'll be referring to it as the subunit vaccine, but it'll be abbreviated as HZSU. So as I've said, there's two models we're talking about today, the GSK model and the Merck model. and then the CDC model is forthcoming. So the research questions that were focused on in this presentation from the GSK model and Merck model are as follows. Looking at adults 60 years old and older who've never received a vaccine for herpes zoster, what is the cost effectiveness of the live vaccine versus no vaccine, the subunit vaccine versus no vaccine, and then the subunit vaccine versus the live vaccine. And this last one, the subunit versus the live, I'll refer to that as the head-to-head. But these three scenarios are important to remember. We'll be referring to them throughout. And the majority of our attention will be focused on the subunit versus no vaccine scenario. And also, just to say, both models did a lot of other analysis, and they could not be included in this presentation just due to time restrictions. So our base case results for the cost effectiveness from these two models. We've got on the left-hand side the identification of the model, GSK and Merck. This is the live vaccine versus no vaccine scenario. And then the third column is the subunit vaccine versus no vaccine scenario. Calling your attention to the live vaccine results. GSK and Merck found $120,000 to $125,000 per quality-adjusted life year. This is a pretty close finding for two separately made cost-effectiveness models. Let's look at the live vaccine versus the subunit vaccine, and just look at the models independently. So in both models, GSK and Merck, the live vaccine scenario had a higher cost-effectiveness ratio than the subunit vaccine scenarios. Things get a little more interesting when we look at the subunit vaccines together, because the Merck model identified a cost-effectiveness ratio of the subunit vaccine of $74,000 per quality-adjusted life year, which is greater than what GSK found, which was $12,000 per quality-adjusted life year. The next section of this talk will be figuring out exactly why these two values are different. And we're going to start that discussion by looking at initial vaccine efficacy and waning of immunity assumptions. This is the initial vaccine efficacy from both models for a single dose and 2 doses of the subunit vaccine. We've got initial vaccine efficacy on the y-axis and age groups on the x-axis. The circle in red is the difference between the two models. The GSK model assumes a single dose of the subunit vaccine confers 90% vaccine efficacy initially, and the Merck model assumes it was 73%. Contrast that difference with how similar they are in the 2-dose assumption. So that was the initial efficacy. This is the efficacy through time. And the GSK model, again, is in orange, starts at 90%, which it was on the last graph, and then declines gradually until year 16. By contrast, the Merck model starts at 73% and declines to 0% after 1 year. For 2 doses of the subunit vaccine, the models are fairly similar for the first 5 years, and then the GSK model declines, the Merck model declines, but the GSK model declines at a more gradual rate. The next slide will get into what if we resolve some of these differences, what does that do to our estimated cost-effectiveness ratio? So we'll start by looking at the subunit versus no vaccine scenario. This is the GSK model base case result, which we've seen previously, $12,000 per quality. This is the Merck model base case result, $74,000 per quality. If in the GSK model they produced a sensitivity analysis where they manipulated some of their parameters in these ways. They lowered the second dose compliance rate, they lowered the first dose efficacy, and they increased the rate of waning following a single dose of the subunit vaccine. Doing this, changing these inputs, resulted in an increase in the cost-effectiveness ratio, bringing it a lot closer to what Merck did for their base case. And just to foreshadow a discussion later, this sort of sensitivity analysis is pretty common in these models. And I'm going to try to summarize in a later slide what a bunch of these simulation or a bunch of these sensitivity analyses would look like relative to the base case. But before I get to that, we'll talk briefly about their vaccine cost assumptions. Vaccine costs are very important for cost effectiveness in general. For the live vaccine, both models assume a comparable cost of about $200 per single dose. For the subunit vaccine, the GSK model assumes a single dose costs $140, and the Merck model assumes a single dose costs $106. When you account for the fact that there's 2 doses of the subunit vaccine, as well as vaccine administration fees, the total cost of the subunit vaccine in each of the models, total cost meaning the 2-dose cost, is $320 for the GSK model and $250 for the Merck model. Okay, so moving on to cost effectiveness in general. In this scenario, we're comparing the subunit vaccine to no vaccine. These are the base case results that we've seen before. $12,000 for the Merck, $12,000 for GSK, $74,000 for Merck. And what I did with the next click of the button is all of the sensitivity analyses, I identified the extreme values produced by them, and that yielded these error bars. And so this would be an extreme point in the sensitivity analysis from the Merck model. And this would be an extreme point from the sensitivity analysis of the Merck model. Okay, so there's 3 takeaways from this. 1, these error bars overlap. 2, even at their extreme points, they're all underneath $150,000 per quality-adjusted life year. And a final point, though this y-axis is truncated at 0, there were many sensitivity analysis simulations in the Merck or in the GSK model that yielded cost-saving outcomes, but we don't present those numerically, but they were in there. Okay, moving on to the head-to-head scenario. So in these scenarios, we're comparing the subunit vaccine to the live vaccine, and we have our models identified here, our scenario descriptions. We have 2 base cases, 1 from each model, and then I picked out scenarios that most favored either the subunit or the live vaccine. First thing to notice is that in both base cases from both models, the subunit vaccine was found to be cost-saving relative to the live vaccine. The only case when the live vaccine was found to be cost-saving relative to the subunit vaccine was in a scenario in the Merck model that favored the live vaccine. Okay, moving on to summary and limitations discussion. So, in the base case, the cost effectiveness of the subunit vaccine versus no vaccine was between $12,000 and $74,000 per quality adjusted life year. Sensitivity analysis, this range broadened to be from cost saving to $150,000 per quality gained. In the scenario of the live vaccine versus no vaccine, looking at the base case, the cost effectiveness was $120,000 to $125,000 per quality. Sensitivity analysis, and only Merck did sensitivity analysis on the live vaccine. The range was $60,000 to $260,000. In the head-to-head, which we just looked at, the base case of both models found that the subunit vaccine was cost-saving. There was one case where the live vaccine was cost-saving relative to the subunit vaccine, and that was in the Merck model with parameters that favored the live vaccine. So some of the important factors that influence the difference across models is that the items we discussed earlier, the efficacy of a single dose of the subunit vaccine and the waning efficacy of the single dose and the long-term waning efficacy of 2 doses of the subunit vaccine. Many other factors were also important in determining overall cost effectiveness. Those included vaccine cost, the regimen completion rate, HZ incidence, and the cost to treat a case with and without PHN. Limitations of the study, which we've already kind of covered, but they bear repeating because this uncertainty is out there. There's limited empirical data on several parameters, and the price of the subunit vaccine has not been officially published. With that, I would just like to say thank you very much for your attention, and thanks to all the teams and people who collaborated and helped me build these slides.
Thank you very much for that extremely clear presentation. Let's take some questions on this. Go ahead, Dr. Kemp.
First of all, a terrific presentation. Thank you very much. I think from what you said that the Merck base case assumed only one immunization. And so I'm not sure if this question is for you or for them, but that seems like, since it's licensed as a 2-dose vaccine, I don't understand the rationale for that. Can you explain that?
I can clarify a little bit. So in both models, they accounted for the fact that regimen completion may not be 100%. And so of the portion who did not complete their series, what would be the immunity for the person who just got 1 dose? That's what that immunity was about.
Dr. Hunter?
So follow up on that is, was there a criteria and a sensitivity analysis for various levels of completion? So, 0%, 50%, 100% of the population finished the 2nd dose?
Sure, there was. The base case assumption for 2nd dose completion for the Merck model was 73%, and for the GSK model, it was 68%. Their lower bounds, I think for both, were about 45%, and the upper bounds, I believe, were 90%, plus or minus 1 or 2.
Dr. Thompson?
Thank you. I just wondered if you could give us a little bit of intuition behind the different assumptions on the waning. They're very different behaviors. One looks like the first dose is just totally different curves there. So could you just explain a little bit why the companies are looking at this very differently? What's the logic? What's the evidence? Are they looking at the first dose as a priming dose? And what's going on in the assumptions that are in fact contributing to the big differences as in the 2 models on that factor?
Sure. I'll provide a comment on the literature as it stands, but then as to the motivation for the selection of their particular waning rates, I'll defer to the companies that are in the audience, I believe. So the literature on a single dose of the subunit vaccine, there is no data on what that efficacy would be. And so Merck based their result on some internal data, and, GSK based their result on internal data, Merck based their result on an assumption. And as to the motivations, that would be for either of the manufacturers to speak on.
Dr. Brezovitz, would you like to comment?
Sure, thank you. Just specific to that question, you're right, there are no data published for the 1-dose subunit vaccine, and so we basically had to guess or try to come up with some estimate. And the basis for our, and that was not just in terms of the 1-dose efficacy, but also the durability of that dose. And so the line that you saw on slide 16 or 17, I don't remember which one it was based on that. And it was really based on the phase 2 study results on the immunogenicity data that was published by GSK, which basically led them to, to basically do their pivotal trials with the 2-dose vaccine. And their phase 2 study showed that after 1 dose, they didn't get to what the peak was after 2 doses, and then after 3 years, it basically came down close to baseline. And so that's what we use to assess our durability of the. Number 1 was what we thought might be efficacy, and number 2, what might be durability. Does that answer that question, Nancy?
Dr. Friedland, you want to comment also?
Absolutely. Dr. Friedland from GSK, thank you. So when we looked at our data, we needed to come up with an assumption for what vaccine efficacy would be for 1 dose, even though this is a 2-dose vaccine, and what the waning rates would be. So in phase 2, we had a study which looked at 1 dose. We were able to show that immunity was maintained above baseline out to 3 years, both for cellular and humoral immunity. And then in addition, we looked at what would the rate of waning be. And so here we took the assumption that why would the rate of waning be any different for the subunit vaccine versus the live vaccine? The live vaccine wanes at approximately 5.1 to 5.4% per year. So that was the rate that we put into our model for one dose.
Thank you. Other questions? Dr. Lee?
Thank you. That was a really nice presentation. And I think that some of my questions relate to things that probably you already have answers to that I just am interested in understanding. And one being, what type of models were built for these two different analyses? Are these Markov models? Are they Markov microsimulation models? So that's one question. And then also related to that is the time horizon for these models, over how long, and was discounting used for those models? And then I'll have another question for you.
Sure. So both were lifetime models, and they both did include discounting. I would call them both Markov models, and they actually did have, they did present simulation results, but I didn't summarize that here just out of the timeliness of it.
No, you did a great job presenting. And then I guess related to that is, so the estimates for the ZVL versus no vaccine were quite similar for the two, which I think was reassuring on one hand, but also because the assumptions might be different that go into those models. Did you look further to say if you would use the same assumptions about disease incidence, whatever other things that might come into this, is it the same result, or are they the same because they use different assumptions, just happen to get to the same result?
So to me, a lot of their assumptions were very comparable, very similar costs per case. Their waning immunity assumptions and efficacy assumptions for the live vaccine were super close. To me, it just looked like they relied on the evidence that was out there that was published, and they drew the same parameters or very similar ones.
Okay. And then I think the last thing that would be helpful might be, and maybe this would be in a different detailed document, but just understanding the price assumptions, which I think this will rest on, and then also just understanding what the ranges for sensitivity analysis were and whether or not PSA would be sort of typically used in this situation or these types of models, or if we would rely on sort of one ways to help us understand what the most like the sort of robustness of these analyses.
Sure. So I didn't present any PSA results. Both models did produce PSA results. When you look at the error bars that I constructed based on the one-way and scenario sensitivity analyses, those error bars contained, and this would be an estimate, but 80 to 90% of the PSA results. So that's one of your questions. The other question about price, the Merck model assumed a price parity for the subunit vaccine, they assumed a price parity with the live vaccine. And around that price parity, they expanded it plus or minus 20%, I believe. For the GSK model, they assumed a base case of $145 with an upper bound of $175 and a lower of $125, I believe. As to the motivation behind those ranges, that would be for the manufacturers to say.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Reingold?
So just going back to the back and forth about the question of what the pattern of waning would be after vaccination and assuming a constant rate of waning, it seems to me the data that Dr. Klein showed were that at least for the one vaccine where we have a lot of data that the effectiveness drops dramatically in the first year and then stays relatively constant after that. And so from a clinical protection point of view, it would seem to me that's a better model of what's going to happen than constant waning.
Dr. Brezhnitz?
Yeah, just I was going to make a comment on the one-dose issues, but we've already discussed that, so I'm going to limit it to the two-dose waning since it's relevant to this. I don't presume necessarily what my colleagues in GSK did in terms of plotting out the model for the two-dose durability, but it's been mentioned and actually presented at the last ACIP meeting, the 9-year data. And maybe that was what was applied to their model for durability after 2 doses. But I want to remind the ACIP here that those data were presented at the last ACIP meeting, and they were based on a phase 2 study. Those were not immunologic data that came from the ZOE studies, and it was immunologic data that involved 70 people in the phase 2 trial, a group that was homogeneous from Europe. So that is not representative of what was in the ZOE 50 and 70, and that's what's I think, being based on the model for the durability of the vaccine that goes out to 30 years. And the only other point I want to make is that the cost-effectiveness models that you did a great job in presenting. I mean, often we listen to this, and sometimes it's hard to understand it, but you made it very clear. This is for 60 and over, but the policy question that was done in the great analysis today for Zostavax and also for Shingrix the last time was for 50 and over. So what we're seeing today is a 60 and over. And the last, just one other thing about that immunologic data that goes out to 9 years. I mentioned it was presented last time. That is on the ACIP website. If you've lost your handout, you can go back and take a look at it. And when you look at that immunologic data, there is a drop, about a 4-4 drop from the response immediately after 2 doses to what you see at 9 years. And the bottom quartile of the point estimate at 9 years overlaps with the top quartile of the estimate at baseline. So there's no correlative protection, so I don't know that we can say necessarily anything about what the real durability is or the effectiveness is with that data, but it does really decline over time when you look at that. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Friedland.
Yes, thank you. So for the waning assumptions in the model, many of us don't have the full report that was submitted and reviewed by the CDC economic team, but the data for waning came from the ZOE 50 and 70 studies. And so the actual numbers are that the rate of waning for the first 4 years in people 50 to 70 was 1%, and then was 2.3% from years 5 and beyond. And for individuals over the age of 70, the rate of waning was 3.6% throughout the model. And those data come from the phase 3 randomized controlled vaccine efficacy studies.
Thank you for that clarification. I think it'll be really interesting to see the CDC model, having seen these 2 models, and then see how the decisions are made about the data used in the new model. I think we'll move on, if that's okay. Dr. Dooling?